I think it's very important for us to engage in these international comparative conversations about Teach for America. But based on what you've told me today, my impression is that Teach for All is an American export best left on the shelf. Welcome to episode 12 of Truth for America. My name is Julian Vasquez Heilig. I'm a professor of educational leadership and policy studies at California State University, Sacramento. I'm also the elected education chair of the California NAACP. And I'm here with my co-host.
Hi, I'm Jameson Brewer, a recent PhD graduate from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, where I am currently an adjunct instructor as well as working as an adjunct instructor at DePaul University.
Today we're going to talk about the spread of Teach for America to other nations across the world. It's an American export. Teach for America is now exporting itself to many countries around the world. And to talk about this, we brought on two experts. One, we brought on George Joseph, who is a journalist and often writes for The Nation and other media outlets, and has recently written a piece entitled Teach for America Has Gone Global and Its Board Has Strange Ideas. And I'm also here with Rolf Strahlbaur, who has published a few peer-reviewed articles about Teach for All across the world. We're so glad that they can join us today for this, the 12th episode of Truth for America. So let's go ahead and get this conversation kicked off. Could someone just start the conversation by telling us a little bit about what is Teach for All?
Sure, this is Rolf. I could start that off. Well, as Teach for America continued to rise in prominence, especially about 10 years after it had started in the early 2000s, there were a number of folks, particularly people who had done graduate degrees, often in social entrepreneurship or in business or in public policy at Ivy Leagues and other colleges in the US, who returned to their country and were interested in starting some form of program to be social entrepreneurs of some type in their countries of origin. And a number of these folks had been exposed for a number of reasons to Teach for America, whether through case studies in their coursework or a handful of folks who actually were Teach for America core members while during their time in the U.S. that found interest in the model and were interested in doing something similar in their home countries. And a number of folks began to reach out to Wendy Kopp, expressing interest in doing something like that. The first was Teach First in the UK, which started in the early 2000s and was started by a man from the UK who had done Teach for America. But Teach for All only became an organized thing a bit later. It was formally launched in 2007 at the Clinton Global Initiative by Wendy Kopp, where there had begun to be enough folks who were interested in doing something similar in their home countries that they formed this satellite network of sister programs, more or less. And then we got Teach for All, as was organized as a mechanism to support these social entrepreneurs as they tried to do their own things in their own countries. Like, there are a number of folks that have more explicitly that call their program Teach For what their country is, that very explicitly are taking Teach for America's model. As a general mechanism, there are near 40, perhaps already over 40 countries operating with their own programs that are part of Teach for All. Though interestingly, there's also a parallel phenomenon of a number of programs. Ones I'm familiar with are like Indonesia Mengajar, which is a program in Indonesia, which is, there are a couple of publications coming out about that by Tom Moshai from Claremont Graduate University and some of his students, as well as programs like Teach for Madagascar, Teach for Korea, which, even though they have paralleled the name and paralleled their structure and their theory of change, are not formally connected with Teach for All. Oren Pizmoni-Levy at Teachers College is doing some work on that. So it's this interesting combination of both a formal network of folks who are emulating Teach for America, as well as a somewhat echo of that is followed with organizations that aren't necessarily affiliated but are doing similar things and are, for similar reasons, wanting to emulate Teach for America's example.
Interesting. Very interesting.
This is George. I'd also add that there's several examples in which some of the folks starting these chapters or Teach For organizations aren't necessarily from the countries in which they start organizations. For example, in my reporting on Teach for India, Shaheen Mistry, the founder, was actually a woman who was raised and went to private school in Greenwich, Connecticut, went to Tufts, and then transitioned to a nonprofit career in India, a country where she hadn't really spent most of her life, but had sort of ancestral origin and had decided to start a chapter there. A similar thing, I think, occurred in China, where the Teach for China branch, I believe, was actually founded by an Italian American. So we see sort of, in certain cases, relatively cosmopolitan global elite starting branches in various places across the world.
Interesting, very interesting. And you were talking about Teach for All is affiliated already in 40 countries. So, in George's his expose or his reporting in The Nation, he did a sort of a deep dive in India. As I look at the title of your article, you said that they have strange ideas about what poor kids need. Does that dovetail with your comments about who's actually starting these programs?
Yeah, it does. I guess reporters don't always pick their titles, but I guess in this case our editors got it right. Teach for India, if you look at its origin story, it's very interesting. When they would first bring in recruits, according to Shaheen Mistry, the founder's biography, they would often have their fellows, who generally come from elite Indian backgrounds, going to private universities, private schools, etc., from around the country, basically training on how to be poor. In the book, she emphasizes how the recruits would actually, sort of in this Gandhian model, be subjected to days of hunger, days of working on the street, in this sort of ritualistic attempt to understand poverty in a few days and then subsequently transform the classrooms with this almost magical knowledge. That sort of short-sighted understanding of how one can just enter a community and transform it is integral, I think, to the Teach for India model, and probably for the Teach for All model, where they'll have people from across the country come in and, with only an intention of staying for 2 years, believe that they, through some sort of energetic leadership and sort of transformative approach, can fundamentally change the lives of their students. And what I think is interesting is that while in Teach for America, some teachers who start actually are committed to staying in the classrooms or staying in their school districts. And Teach for India, given that the Indian public education system is considered so low status, there was no fellow who I talked to who ever actually said that they would want to stay in the system, would want to stick it out and be a long-term teacher for their students. Idea behind their theory of change, which is similar to the Teach for All theories of change, is that these transformative leaders will come in, get 2 years of experience, and go out into their various roles in the corporate or governmental sectors and sort of change the system with the knowledge they've gained. But it often elides the need for any structural changes that are plaguing the school districts. And by that I mean they very rarely cite a need for increased funding for schools, for increased development, and rather just argue that a new type of ethic or a new type of leadership is what will transform schools and thereby lives.
I have a question, George. You're talking about, I think the phrase that you used was community transformation. And Rolf, you were speaking earlier about social entrepreneurship. Maybe for the benefit of our listeners, Rolf, could you really define social entrepreneurship? And I mean, is that really fit in with what George is getting at here with this idea of community transformation? And how does that play out, in the classroom with this mentality, this theory of change? And how does it play out within the communities, right? So as George said, there tends to be an ignoring of poverty and other systemic issues. But there seems to be a gap here in what's happening in the classroom and what some of the rhetoric suggests about making these community transformations. So maybe you can speak to that.
Sure. I think that there's definitely something to critique, and this has been growing for at least a good 15 years, this notion of the social entrepreneur, especially on the global level, where we often have these examples who are heralded. Often it's folks that you see a lot of folks that get jobs or start organizations in what is broadly called international development, that start nonprofits to say, like what Tom Shoes does for every pair of shoes they sell, they give a pair of shoes to a kid in the developing world. And within education as a broad social entrepreneurship sector in international development, Teach for All has kind of been one example of that, of folks that want to do this kind of work from often this type of more business-based mentality.
But if you think about a social entrepreneur, for me, that elicits positive feelings, right? That you are going to be value added. And I think that's the core of the argument for Teach for America in the United States, is that, well, if they don't have us, then there's nothing. But I think, and that was the argument of Tracy D'Angelo in episode 2. But I think it's pretty clear when you listen to episode 11, and you have the former Teach for America teacher talking about Detroit and talking about New Orleans, and talking about how Teach for America teachers are actually brought in, the word that she used, the word that the Teach for America alum used, as scabs to replace veteran teachers. So thinking about that value-added argument that you often hear from Teach for America, which I clearly don't think applies based on the conversations we've had in this podcast in previous episodes. But why wouldn't you, George or Rolf, whoever would like to take this, I read through George's article, and the way the Teach for All teacher was interacting with the classroom, to me, seemed to be quite problematic. But what about that argument? It's Teach for All or nothing.
I think what's really interesting about the social entrepreneurship culture is that it creates a system in which major social problems, for example, the underfunding of Indian education systems for decades, can be solved through what's termed innovation. If we just get innovative leaders, innovative young people into these classrooms, they, with their elite educational expertise, will be able to sort of make up for these decades of inequality that has been built into the Indian educational system over years. So it's a really convenient ideology in that sense. And I totally agree with Rolf. In a lot of the educational promotional materials for Teach for India, they'll often emphasize how fellows are learning to become leaders in the classroom and how those skills are transferable to any sector. So really the things you learn in the classroom, basically like a management training session over a prolonged period of time. And I think it's really interesting that some of the work that Antonio Olmedo has done on Teach for Germany, many corporate leaders in Germany, especially one of the CEOs of Lufthansa, who said that when we hire Teach for Germany fellows, we're actually getting enhanced recruits because the experience and leadership skills that they get at the classroom, we can then benefit from in our corporations. So Olmedo sort of argues Teach for All almost functions like social MBA program in which young graduates get these leadership skills in the classroom, which they then get to bring to their companies in a way. The sort of transferability between the private sector and the social/public sector initiative is really interesting to me because it basically denies the need for any larger social struggle to address the inequalities that have been built into the system, and instead insists that if we can just produce innovation, we can innovate our way out of poverty, which is obviously a convenient idea for keeping the status quo. If we can just make education a level playing field, then everything else follows. That's literally the line that comes from Shaheen Mistry, the founder of Teach for India.
Again, Julian, just a second ago, you said that, well, when you say social entrepreneurship, that sounds like a public good, like you're doing something good. And honestly, I think this is a larger critique than just a possible critique of Teach for All or Teach for any of Teach for All's affiliates, but this idea that social entrepreneurship inherently means a public good, because you are, as George is saying, arguing the whole idea of an entrepreneur is a business-based idea. It's that anyone with a good idea can go into the market and it will succeed and it will contribute to society. And so the whole idea of social entrepreneurship is that we can take this idea of success, which is based in a business model, which is inherently based in capitalism, when capitalism is inherently based on inequality, that in a capitalist system there will be haves and have-nots, and taking this system that's entirely based on inequality and saying that we can use this in the social sector, quote unquote, in the nonprofit sector, and these innovative ideas here and there will fix poverty, which is I would argue, an inherently flawed notion. It's the reason that, say, the initiatives put forward by Bill Gates or by Mark Zuckerberg, where they say, hey, I'm good at what I do in Silicon Valley, therefore I can they're basically social entrepreneurs on just a much larger level. And they say, because I have success in this arena and because I have innovative ideas in this arena, I can, if I'm Mark Zuckerberg, fix education in Newark, which obviously didn't happen. Or if I'm Bill Gates, I can fix the education system on a federal level, which obviously didn't happen. I would problematize this idea of social entrepreneurship more at its roots.
The question that I was getting at, I think, was half answered. In India, because if you think about these low-fee private schools, the argument for the low-fee private schools is that these children would have no access to education. The argument for Teach for All, which I don't think is applicable here in the U.S. for the cases that we just talked about, but that these students wouldn't have teachers at all if they didn't have Teach for All. Does that argument hold water?
Well, in India, the Right to Education Act, which was enshrined in its most recent iteration in 2009, I believe, is actually a very robust act in that it creates mandatory classroom minimums for classroom size. It demands that states and localities actually provide access to secondary education for students. These are things that have actually been successful over the last few decades in getting a lot more students into the classroom. But they still haven't actually forced cities like Mumbai, India's wealthiest city, the capital of finance, to even fully provide 7th and 8th grade education to students from its poorest sections. Now, Teach for India terms itself a social movement often. I think a great social movement would be one which takes the law that progressive groups in India have fought for and actually fight to ensure its enforceability by holding the Mumbai Municipal Corporation accountable to actually following the Right to Education Act and providing students classrooms, providing students teachers, which they currently do lack. But the idea that making the poorest of the poor in India pay what little salaries they have to unregulated private provider, which by its own economic model cannot afford to provide standards that actually would meet the Right to Education Act criterion, I think is very disturbing. And it violates the spirit of the Indian Right to Education Act, which is to guarantee at least a minimum provision of educational standards for all students, regardless of whether they come from villages or urban slums. And that's just currently not happening, and what progressive social movements need to be pushing forward. It's a shame that Teach for India hasn't done that.
So it sounds like really you're saying that Teach for All is really changing the conversation. The conversation should be about why education is not being delivered according to the Right to Education Act.
Yeah,
but instead we're talking about how corporations can hire folks that have experienced poverty over a few days before they enter the classroom. And then after they've done a short stint, then they find themselves in government positions or other leadership positions in the society. But it sounds like they're stealing education from poor children.
Well, I think what's really significant about Teach for India is not that they even get this experience in the classroom, but it's that it helps create a network between for-profit, low-cost low-income private schools and this sort of new crop of education reformers who can go into a multitude of different avenues. They can go into municipal sector jobs where they could be approving these types of schools. They can go into education entrepreneurship positions in which they're providing software for classrooms or teacher service allocations for classrooms, that type of thing. And you're creating this network which will create sort of the human capital for the low-cost private school sector, which the business community in India views as the answer to India's educational woes and also a pretty significant business opportunity given the millions of people that are desperate for education for their children in the country. But unfortunately, that model, while it will mean far fewer tax dollars for the businessmen of India, will not be able to guarantee education as it's envisioned under India's current Right to Education Act. It currently bans for-profit schooling to a large extent. A lot of the current complaints that are coming from the business community is that the Right to Education Act is hampering the marketization of schools by mandating that schools have bathrooms and fields and these basic provisions and amenities that we think are necessary for a wholesome education.
That's really interesting because what you're talking about internationally and the role of Teach for All in India sounds very similar to the conversations we're having here about charter schools and vouchers. Two ways. One, we know that 1/3 of all Teach for America teachers go into charter schools, and we also know that Teach for America is very involved with, once their alums leave, many of their alums start charter networks. They're avid supporters of charter schools, which are essentially schools that are publicly funded but are privately controlled. They're not officially private schools, but they're public schools that can act like private schools because of the laxness of accountability in most state laws. Then the second piece is the piece about vouchers. And that sort of interaction that you were talking about between these low-fee private schools and the Teach for All folks, vouchers were created as a market-based system. And we know that Pinochet in Chile decided to do vouchers because he wanted government to have less responsibility for education. And so essentially what they do is they shift the cost of education to communities and to families. And so these low-fee private schools essentially do what vouchers do in Chile and our country, is they shift the responsibility of education away from the public, away from society. They shift it to the family budget, which, of course, like you say, is a genius for people that don't want to have publicly provisioned schools for those that are in poor neighborhoods. But it sounds strangely similar. Teach for All hasn't been as successful in every place. Rolf, you've written a little bit about the failure of Teach for All in Brazil. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. But before I get there, I think one thing, just following up on what y'all have said, it's a very interesting conversation. And I think it's important to point out that Teach for America has become a very prominent part of the conversation in most Teach for All countries, especially because this only started in 2007. And depending on what country you're talking about, it's much more recent. And they've only had a few cohorts. And most of these programs start with pilot cohorts of like 30 to 50 teachers. We're talking a very small drop in the bucket of the larger educational projects happening in policy circles in the countries in which Teach for All might be operating. Brazil is a good example where, like most of Latin America, like Chile, like Argentina, though Chile and Argentina, I think, are even much more prominent examples, this push to privatize education, to fund private educational providers with public money in the same way we do charters in the U.S., through voucher systems, has been more or less the status quo for a couple decades. And to a certain degree, Teach for All affiliates in those countries like Enseña Chile and Enseña por Argentina, to a certain degree, operate within that structure in those two countries in particular, and in a number of other Latin American countries, because there aren't necessarily laws for alternative certification like there are in the U.S. The schools in which Teach for All affiliate teachers are often placed in those countries are in private schools that don't have the same regulations. So, I mean, Teach for All affiliates function within those larger parameters, but those conversations are much bigger, with honestly much bigger players than just, say, Teach for All. I mean, where we have folks like the World Bank and the IMF who have been pushing privatization of social sectors, not just education, but health and all of the welfare state and all of the social safety net since the early 80s, since the trend that came with Reagan and Thatcher and the push towards neoliberalism in the 80s. And so I do think it's important to put that in context, to not overemphasize the role of Teach for All in a lot of these countries. I think Teach for All can be a very interesting manifestation of these trends, but isn't necessarily driving the trend or driving the conversation in necessarily the same way as we see in the US, in part just because Teach for America has been around longer. And we have more alumni to fill the roles of folks like Michelle Rhee and so forth than we do in a lot of these other countries.
What's interesting, Rolf, let me just poke in. I think what's interesting about this is that in episode, I think 9, we talked about the birth of Teach for America with a couple of folks that have been involved with Teach for America for many years, including Dr. Ladwick, who was involved with the first evaluation of Teach for America. And what he said at the time is that the role that Teach for America has now, 20 years later, a couple of decades later, is the role that they envisioned for themselves early on. And one of the interesting things when I was in D.C. This last weekend, there was a BAT teacher, and she talked about how they went to the Hill for a Hill Day, and they went to talk with many, many different Congress people about education. And almost every single education staffer was a former Teach for America Corps member, almost every single one. So they spent almost 2 days talking to TFA staffers. And we know that a billionaire from here in California has funded the salaries of those folks on the education committees. And so I think the role of Teach for America is much more mature here, but it sounds like they're undertaking a similar model that down the road, maybe not next year, maybe not 5 years, but if they're recruiting the various elites in the different countries and they're finding their way into positions of power, into policy positions. In the United States, for example, you'll often see Teach for America teachers who are very, very young as human resource directors, as principals. So they're not just in D.C., they're also in very influential roles in the United States. Do you think that Teach for All has a similar strategic goal down the road, even if their power base is not in that spot right now, in that place right now?
I would argue even more so, in the sense that because in a lot of these countries, it's hard to generalize. I want to focus on Latin America in part just because that's where I have a degree in Latin American studies and a lot of my regional training is there. And it's when we're talking about Teach for All, it's impossible to generalize on a global scale. But just focusing on Latin America, for example, the right to education is very well established, and in terms of we're talking single digits of percentages of kids that aren't getting at least some degree of primary education. So, we've had a global push since 1990, since the Education for All initiative and agreement in Chongqing by folks like the UN and UNESCO and so forth, that every child has the right to an education. There are parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, India, other parts of South Asia, where that is still something that's still a goal to an extent, that it's something that's been worked on for the last couple decades. But in a place like Latin America, we've had much smaller numbers in terms of the need to bring folks into the classroom. Getting butts in seats isn't necessarily the problem. The problem is quality of instruction.
Okay.
And there's also a much more robust and rigorous public sector in education with often a very strong union base. We see this in a lot of the headlines we've been seeing out of Mexico with the police repression that's been pushed on the teachers union in Oaxaca, who to a large extent were protesting some very U.S. type, No Child Left Behind type reforms that are being pushed by President Nieto at the moment. We see the same thing throughout much of Latin America, where teachers are very strongly unionized. Teacher unions have a very strong public voice. Teacher education traditionally, especially in Brazil, is often much more overtly critical. We have to remember Brazil is where Paulo Freire came from, and Paulo Freire is still very much a heralded figure. So, most people who get a traditional teacher education degree from one of the main universities in Brazil will be much more critically minded than, say, someone who would go to a teacher ed program in the U.S. And part of why that's interesting, I'd like to go a bit into the example of what I've written just for anonymity's purposes, and in part because this organization as such doesn't exist anymore, what I call Teach for Brazil. There were a very interesting case of this. It was around 2010. They recruited primarily, as Teach for America did when it started, at the most prestigious universities in Brazil. Though Brazil, like much of Latin America, has an interesting case where the most prestigious universities are the public universities, which are the big research universities. And so you get this interesting dynamic, and this isn't just in Brazil, this is across most of Latin America, where if you want the highest quality K-12 education, you go to private school. But the most high-quality university educations are in these big flagship public schools, which are always free in terms of tuition, in part as a means to grant access to poorer communities. But because there are only so many of them and there's a bottleneck, ironically, those who get into the big prestigious public universities and get free tuition are typically those whose parents could afford to send them to the best private schools, who had private tutors, who went to private after-school courses to take test prep for their college entrance exams and so forth. And so the big public research universities, like where Teach for Brazil recruited, are very prestigious, but also very elite institutions where most of the folks who were recruited in what I'm calling Teach for Brazil, they only had a pilot cohort. They brought in one cohort of about 30 teachers. It depends on how you estimate how many were in that cohort, because depending on how you count, a number of those folks left at various points during their 2-year commitment. A number of folks left during the first year, left after 1 year, a fair amount left after 1 year, and a number more left during the second year. So, I mean, depending on where you're counting, they started with around 30, ended with more like 20. But most of these folks were coming from these major elite research universities. And because of that, not all, but most of them had very elite backgrounds. Interestingly, for a number of them, because of this context in which I described earlier, many of them, when they became Teach for Brazil teachers, that was the first time they'd ever set foot in a public K-12 school. What was interesting was, because there was no alternative certification, as there isn't in most of Latin America, but there isn't the same level of publicly funded private schools as there is in, say, Chile or Argentina. In order to place teachers in this pilot program, they adapted the model of Teach for America somewhat. They wanted to move in relatively quickly and grab momentum while it lasted, because they had a great deal of support from the mayoral administration of the time of Rio de Janeiro, which was Eduardo Paes. He's still the mayor. But at the time, he had a very polemical but public education secretary. Claudia Costin is a very familiar type figure in her profile to many of the type of reformers we often see in the U.S. She had no background in education. She had a long background. I think her actual degree is in administration, I think business administration, but she had previously been a secretary. I'm forgetting what the ministry was, but it was not education in the state of São Paulo. She had been brought in part because she was known for taking a very kind of no excuses, accountability-driven, bottom-line approach to public sector management, and they thought she would be an effective manager. She had previously worked for the World Bank, training as an economist, and so she was brought in and was seen as a very polemical figure by public school teachers, much the same way as, say, Joel Klein in New York, or Cami Anderson, or Michelle Rhee, or a number of these figures that we have in the U.S., but she was very supportive of bringing in a Teach for All affiliate. And so they wanted to grab momentum while it lasted. And so what they did was they ended up changing the program to fit into a particular program that was happening in Rio at the time called the Schools of the Future. It was a project specifically to try and boost achievement in some of the lower performing public Rio schools. And I think one thing to keep in mind, and this is true through a lot of Latin America, and especially through a lot of Brazil, when you're talking about the public school system predominantly, for the very, very most part, with some exceptions, serves poor children. Middle class and up children, basically anyone whose parents can afford to send them to private school, do. And so the schools that are being funded by tax dollars, schools that are public schools, most of those who are policymakers are folks who could afford to go to college. There are very few people making decisions about public schools who actually attended public schools. And that's a trend not just within Teach for Brazil or Teach for All in Brazil, but more generally, just because public schools serve a much lower income bracket. Kids that were studying in the morning would get these enrichment programs through the afternoon to be kind of a stopgap measure to try and lengthen the school day. Teach for Brazil became one of these programs. They more or less became a tutoring program where the Teach for Brazil teachers were meant to be tutors in a core subject of one of the subjects that was tested on the Prova Brasil, Portuguese, or so the equivalent of ELA, people teaching literacy and so forth. Some taught math. They started with some people teaching science too, but in the second year, most of the science teachers were shifted to math because math scores were still really bad. So again, they were seen more as, at the city of Rio level, they saw Teach for Brazil as, we're bringing in a name of an organization that has, cachet from the States, and it'll also help us out by, we'll put them in these lowest performing schools, and they'll be helping tutor, basically effectively trying to double instruction in these core subjects so that hopefully we'll boost up our test scores next year.
A lot of that sounds very familiar, of course, to the U.S. context. But actually, this sounds more desirable and ideal in terms of what I think many people that have often been critics of Teach for America would probably support, which is Teach for America teachers, instead of having their own classroom and struggling when they first hit the classroom after institute, if they are not, folks similar to Jameson who had been traditionally trained before they started. It sounds like this is actually a more ideal situation. Why did it collapse on itself? What do you, quickly, because we're running out of time, why do you think Teach for All, do you think it was because it was this tutoring construct, or do you think why did it collapse?
I think there are a number of factors. One was that even though it could be seen that this is a more desirable model than often what we see in other places, part of the problem was that this was put in very top down. It was the city administration that was like, yeah, this program's great. We're going to implement it in these schools. These folks are going to be supposed to be reinforcing core subjects, so help them out. And at the school level, there was often a lot of pushback where both administrators and teachers of those core subjects were like, I'm doing my job. I don't really want to have to deal with this tutor who has no real pedagogical background. The Teach for Brazil teachers received in Institute, most of their curriculum was very based in the Institute models from Teach for America at the time. They all got translated copies of Teach Like a Champion. Most of the curriculum materials that folks got at Institute were just translated in Portuguese and handed over. And so there was a big incentive for the Teach for Brazil teachers to show that they were having an impact on their kids' test scores, because this was still a private pilot program. They had some corporate backing, but they were trying to get more sustainable. And so there was a big push from Teach for Brazil as an organization on these teachers. At least most of my interviews were with Teach for Brazil teachers, and all of them felt a very strong push that they had to show that they were having an impact. And they wanted this personally as well, because they had, from the way they had been recruited and from what they had heard about Teach for America, they were looking forward, this transformational experience where, the hero teacher narrative we see in a lot of movies. I think one of the things that I found most interesting in my work, and which I think will be most interesting to look at in Teach for All going forward, is that of the folks that were brought in to join Teach for Brazil in their pilot cohort, the majority of them actually ended up leaving their experience having begun to question a lot of the kind of more social entrepreneurship models of change, and having much more of a dedication to try and protect and uphold public education, which I found very interesting, and is something that I've heard from a couple of other researchers is something they're seeing often among Teach for All folks as well, in part because these are smaller programs in countries where there often are already big pushes to sustain public education, to defend the public sector. It's interesting to see, to a certain degree, sometimes how participation in Teach for All can actually, instead of creating folks that will be the supporters of education reform in the next generation, instead radicalizing folks that often are pushing back against education reform in a number of these countries. I think that'll be an interesting trend to look at going forward.
What I think I took from this conversation was the importance of understanding the local context of each country when thinking about Teach for All. Rolf mentioned how in Brazil you have a relatively robust teacher training system. Sounds similar to America, although it may have more critical pedagogy. Whereas in India, a lot of the teacher training system is left up to the private sector and is often very poor quality because there's little regulation and people are more or less paying for degrees. They're not paying much, so many of the teachers are coming from their own neighborhoods, which is good and something we should appreciate. But in India, one of the major problems is that the government doesn't allocate provisions to ensure a strong system of teacher training that's accessible and thorough for people from communities who wish to contribute and be lifelong teachers. I would also echo what Rolf said in the sense that I was surprised and happy that several of the responses I got to the Teach for India article were actually from former Teach for India fellows who were really connecting to what I had written. And I got more positive responses from former fellows than I did negative ones. And I think the reason for that is, especially in the developing world context, the inadequacy of the Teach for All theory of change is just so stark, because bringing in a young, idealistic person into a classroom in which you have no fan, no windows, rain is coming down on you, snakes are literally coming out of the walls at times, students are crammed in, all the different structural deficiencies are readily apparent. And it quickly becomes clear to the fellows that what they're trying to do just won't cut it oftentimes. There was one woman who I observed, very interesting. She could barely speak to her students because she didn't know their native language. And I asked her, okay, after, what do you think you're getting out of this program? And she said, I don't think I'm making a difference for these students, but maybe something I did, they'll remember some memory of me, and that will inspire them in the way that they treat their children. And so it was just such a faint impact she felt she was having that it really went against the narrative that Teach for All recruits, I think, are often given, that they will be these almost superhero-like figures. And so potentially we'll see a more robust resistance from within Teach for All chapters across the world we have yet to see.
So I just want to say thanks to George and Rolf for being our guests today and engaging in a very lively conversation, and particularly also thank George for a piece that was published. I think it really brought a lot of attention to Teach for All, and as Rolf said earlier, this is not something that a lot of us are talking about here domestically. Those of us who research Teach for America, thinking about how the organization has spread globally. And I think that part of our conversation really brought out some things to think about, right? Are there ways that the organization is making better approach, or the conglomerate of organizations that it is, are they making better approaches? But something that really struck me, we didn't get a chance to talk about it today, but in George's piece, you really talked about you were observing some overly punitive and very public tracking consequences within the classroom. From my experience in Teach for America here domestically, it really approaches Teach for America's approach, right? So that's Lee Cantor's assertive discipline that our guest Emma discussed on episode 11. So I think that moving forward, as more of us in the United States and researchers globally are thinking about and having conversations about Teach for All as it spread, I think it'd be interesting to see what aspects of the domestic Teach for America are exported as they are, and regardless of the culture that they find themselves in, regardless of the country, are the approaches to education, are the approaches to the classroom and pedagogy, are they oppressive, or are they liberating students in the process of their daily lives? So thanks to the guests.
I think it's very important for us to engage in these international comparative conversations about Teach for America, but based on what you've told me today, my impression is that Teach for All is an American export best left on the shelf.